Good evening and welcome to our special event with Mr. Ernest Scheyder. I am Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. Ernest Scheyder is senior correspondent for Reuters and the author of The War Below, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives, which was longlisted for the 2024 National Book Award for Nonfiction and the Financial Times Schroeder's Business Book of the Year. A native of Maine, actually Kennebunk, Maine, not too far from our president, and he attended the University of Maine and Columbia Journalism School and started the school newspaper in his high school. This is his first book. If his other books are like this one, I think he's going to be a famous figure very soon. If you have any questions, please write them on the cards. Have we passed the cards out yet? Yes? We're passing them out. Write the names, the questions on the card, and pass them to the end. I will go through them as we sit down and ask the questions after Ernest is finished. Please.
Now. How about this? All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Thank you, Andrew, for your great introduction. Appreciate it. This is my first time in College Station, and I got to say I'm really enjoying being here on your beautiful campus. As Andrew mentioned, I'm a native of Maine. I grew up actually learning to drive near Walker Point. I remember vividly as a 16-year-old with my driving instructor going around those topsy-turvy roads, and I'm still here. And so it's great. It's great to be able to share a few reflections with you today on a conflict that is really engulfing the globe. This is not a conflict taking place with traditional weapons or with traditional soldiers, although they certainly play a role here. It's not on the evening news programs, although perhaps it should be. And it's not common household knowledge, although its ramifications affect every single person on this planet. This is a conflict over where and how the world procures the vital building blocks for our modern economies. In order to build electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, laptops, the microphone I'm speaking into right now, the cell phone in your hand, and millions of other devices, means the world must dig more mines to extract lithium, copper, cobalt, rare earths, and many other critical minerals. The term critical is apt here, for there are no known substitutes for many of these minerals. Just to give you a sense of their relevance, lithium is the lightest metal on the periodic table of the elements, and it's exceptionally good at retaining a charge. That makes it the perfect cornerstone element for the lithium-ion battery. Buzz Aldrin, the Apollo 11 astronaut, speaks fondly in his memoir of a lithium derivative known as lithium hydroxide, largely because it helps absorb carbon dioxide. It's a pretty critical function in the recesses of space. Copper is one of the best electricity-conducting metals, and it's easy to shape and form. It's also corrosion-resistant and binds well with other metals. Silver conducts electricity better than copper, but silver is a lot more expensive. Just think about this. The average 747 jetliner from Boeing has 135 miles of copper wiring. Every single American household has an average of 400 pounds of copper wiring and piping. Nickel helps resist corrosion and helps extend a lithium-ion battery's range. Cobalt, added to a battery, mitigates spontaneous explosions known as thermal runaway. And rare earths are a collection of 17 minor metals that are used to make magnets that turn power into motion. You've got one in your pocket right now. The device that vibrates your cell phone is made with a rare earth magnet. These are just 5 crucial designations for critical minerals that are increasingly powering our world. Just think, for example, of all the devices in your home that are powered by lithium-ion batteries today that weren't even 20 years ago. I have an anecdote in my book where I talk about leaf blowers, and that might sound like a basic or whimsy device, but these historically have been powered by 2-stroke engines and increasingly are being powered by lithium-ion batteries because manufacturers tell us they're better for the planet. And now just extrapolate that across many other devices in your house, and you realize this is about so much more than just electric vehicles. Our rising appetite for these critical minerals is evident, yet this barely registers with the average person. In 2019, when the United Nations declared the International Year of the Periodic Table of Chemical Elements to honor the 150th anniversary of Dmitry Mendelev's creation of the iconic chart, the average shopper in a department store probably would have struggled to identify which of its constituent members go into a computer battery, or an automobile, or a solar panel. Just over a quarter of Americans told a survey that same year that they had never heard of rare earth elements, the crucial materials that make those magnets I just referenced. Yet despite their importance, mines to source these critical minerals are deeply unpopular across many Western countries, even as they have a crucial role to play in powering these technologies and fighting climate change. Throughout the world, supplies of metals sit atop land considered by some to be sacred, or too special, or too ecologically sensitive to disturb. Whether these lands should be dug up in an attempt to diffuse climate change and power our lives is one of the defining questions of our time. The International Energy Agency estimates that by 2035, the world will only have 70% of the copper that it needs and only half of the lithium it needs. To achieve the ambitious targets of the Paris Climate Accords, roughly $800 billion will need to be invested across the globe during that time frame, the IEA further estimates. For the United States, which has less than 5% of the world's population, but consumes nearly 20% of its energy, this new energy economy requires a collective reflection to which many are not accustomed. Other governments, too, are grappling with this transition, including China, which has 18% of the world's population and consumes a quarter of its energy. Now, in the 1980s, China realized shrewdly that whoever controls the extraction and processing of these critical minerals will control the 21st century economy the way that control of petroleum extraction and processing defined the 20th century economy. And so, China went to work, investing capital in mines not only within its own borders, but in geological deposits across Africa, South America, Asia, Australia, and elsewhere. It invested heavily in processing facilities, including smelters, and gave manufacturers discounts on metals if they relocated their operations to mainland China. It also invested heavily in education, realizing that to achieve its ambitions, its workers would need more technical know-how than any other nation. And so as we sit here today, China has 44 accredited mining engineering universities, the largest of which has 1,500 students alone studying how to build and run mines and processing facilities. In the United States, there's only 14 accredited mining engineering programs. That's down from 25 in 1982, according to the National Mining Association. There were only 327 mining degrees awarded by America's universities in 2020, down nearly 40% in just 4 years. By the end of this decade, the United States will see the retirement of roughly half of its existing mining workforce, about 220,000 people. Where will their replacements come from? China has leapfrogged the rest of the world and dominates this critical minerals industry because of these steps that it's taken. The US Geological Survey considers 50 minerals to be critical. China is the top producer for 30. Last year, the United States was reliant on China and Canada for more than 50% of 21 of those critical minerals. And the US is 100% reliant on imports for 15 of them, including manganese, used to harden steel, which obviously are used to make skyscrapers and other large buildings, and graphite, which is the largest metal by volume in a lithium-ion battery. China is also the world's largest copper consumer and aggressively buys the red metal from Chile, Peru, and other nations, using critical minerals as a key diplomatic tool. US copper production has been slipping from 2017, but the US has twice as much copper as China. Indonesia holds the world's largest supplies of nickel, and has moved to block exports of this key metal in order to build its own electric vehicle industry. The only US nickel mine, meanwhile, will be depleted next year. The US does not have a nickel refinery as well. Chile and Australia are the world's largest lithium producers, but rely on China to process much of that metal into a form usable for lithium-ion batteries. Two of the world's largest lithium companies are Chinese, and the United States produces only scant amounts of this white metal currently. Plans to build a major lithium refinery here in the United States were put on hold last year due, in part, to overproduction by Chinese rivals that dragged down lithium prices. The Democratic Republic of the Congo holds the world's largest supplies of cobalt, but child labor can be used there sometimes to extract the mineral. And that's obviously a source of large concern for automakers, regulators, and policymakers. Yet Chinese miners operating in the DRC have been boosting production in a transparent bid for a greater share of the global cobalt market. That's pushed the only US cobalt mine out of business. Its equipment now sits fallow on the side of an Idaho mountain. The only US source of this critical mineral can't make any money, so its workers were laid off. In rare earths, those metals that used to make magnets that turn power into motion, that's actually an industry started by the United States right after World War II. But slowly, the country let the entire industry move to China, which now controls more than 80% of their processing. Without rare earths, there would be no wind turbines, no Teslas, no F-35 fighter jets. Washington's attempt to wean itself off supplies from China have been halting at best, fueling a lopsided trade balance that favors Beijing-aligned mining companies, manufacturers, and their customers. To be sure, there are some attempts by governments to address this imbalance. The European Union will require by 2027 that all EV batteries sold within its borders have a so-called battery passport, showing where the metals inside that battery were extracted and processed. Here in the United States, 2022's Inflation Reduction Act tied consumer tax credits and other financial incentives to domestic minerals production. Yet opposition to mines in the United States and Europe has long forced both to rely on imports, a step that ironically has boosted global greenhouse gas emissions by increasing shipping from overseas mines to processing facilities, most of which are in Asia. The United States wants to go green, but to do that, it needs to produce more metals, especially lithium, rare earths, and copper. That means more mines, and mines are very controversial in the United States. Who wants to live next to a giant hole in the ground? Mines are dusty. They increase truck traffic, they use dynamite for blasting that can rattle windows and crack foundations. Many mines throughout history have polluted waterways and produced toxic waste that scarred landscapes for generations. They also require astronomical amounts of water to operate. Stuart Udall, who ran the US Interior Department for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, once famously quipped that mining was a, quote, search and destroy mission, end quote. And one need not look too far back in time to find egregious examples of a mining industry not operating at its best. In May 2020, the mining giant Rio Tinto blew up Aboriginal rock shelters in Western Australia that had stood for more than 46,000 years. The move was entirely legal. Rio had followed the permitting process. But it drew immediate outcry because the company had destroyed a site considered sacred to the traditional owners, known as the PKK peoples. As bad as that was, it paled in comparison to what had happened in Brazil the year prior at a mining complex owned by Vale, another industry giant. In January 2019, as hundreds of employees were in a Brumadinho mess hall eating lunch, the nearby B1 tailings dam collapsed and released a torrent of toxic sludge that quickly subsumed the dining hall, its inhabitants, and much of the nearby countryside. Nearly 300 people died. The tragedy was all the worse because this tailings dam had been known to be structurally unsound for some time, yet the industry did not address it. Are these risks, are these tragedies to be tolerated on the road to a green energy future? Conversely, if countries, especially in the West, halt mining projects out of these concerns, does that hasten the onset of climate change while also giving other nations economic weapons? Despite all these risks I just enumerated, mines are paradoxically truly necessary to battle climate change and to power our lives. Recycling alone cannot provide the materials needed to fuel this transition. And that's why I argue forcefully in the book that a collective debate on how best to address the energy transition's needs is urgent. The oil and natural gas revolution that swept the global economy in the late 19th century and early 20th century involved little to no collective weighing of the environmental, social, and economic costs and benefits of burning fossil fuels. Indeed, while the muckraking journalist Ida Tarbell became famous for exposing the malfeasance of John D. Rockefeller's Senior Standard Oil, she did so primarily to point out his greed and monopolistic business practices, not the environmental harm that can, in some cases, be caused by oil extraction and refining. The electrification transformation now taking place does and must involve a dialogue about what society is willing to accept and what it is expecting. And in some sense, to rely on other nations for the building blocks of green energy is to perpetuate the very kind of economic colonialism that has pervaded Western cultures for centuries. In The Nutmeg's Curse, a seismic tome on climate change and human exploitation, author Amitav Ghosh explores how what we think of as the root causes of the climate crisis, coal, crude oil, natural gas, etc., extend further back to the 15th century and to the enslavement of Banda Isla residents by Dutch invaders to produce nutmeg via forced plantation farming. By imposing such a rigorous and destructive style of cultivation that eschewed traditional farming techniques, Ghosh argues, the seeds of the climate crisis were planted. Extrapolating Ghosh's core argument for the green energy transition requires grappling with where, how, and why each nation procures its own building blocks for this transition, and that there likely will not be such a transition until the globe reckons with how the climate crisis began. Not grappling with these issues in the 20th century led to our current situation, which has multiple armed conflicts over oil and to a giant cartel that controls more than a third of global oil production. Yet now before its very eyes, the United States is watching its petroleum dependence on the Organization for the Petroleum Exporting Countries transition into a dependence on China and others for the building blocks of our electrified economy. Wars were fought in the 20th century over oil. Without adequate copper supply, in the 21st century, wars could very well be fought over copper, the consultancy S&P Global has warned. And we've just seen today that there are strong trade implications to these issues. China has already blocked exports to the United States of germanium and gallium, two minor metals used to make semiconductors, as well as graphite. Beijing has also threatened to block the export of technology used to process rare earths and lithium, signaling that its prowess in these areas will likely be used as key tools. But just this morning, Beijing further restricted exports to the United States of 5 more critical minerals, including tungsten and molybdenum. So what are we to make of all of this? How do we move forward? These issues require tough deliberation, and a proper weighing of all of them will require a collective reflection to which many of us in the West perhaps are not familiar, yet these issues matter. I'd like us all to think back roughly 5 years ago this month, just as we all began to grapple with the coronavirus pandemic. Many here in the United States were shocked to learn that we did not make any masks, that essential piece of equipment that we all had to wear for a good chunk of time. Medical-grade masks were invented by scientists at 3M, a good American company, yet the production and processing of those masks had been sent to overseas many, many years prior. And in the United States, I think that underscored the importance of supply chains. It can be a bit of a wonky topic, but I think when people began to realize that this essential bit of equipment that we all needed was not even produced within our own borders, it underscored that where and how we get the building blocks for things we use every single day matters. And so that's the kind of ethos that I wanted to bake into the book here. I deliberately did not take sides in this narrative. I wanted the reader to have to wade through these shades of gray and decide for her or himself which way to move forward on these complex issues. To get a sense of the issues, I want to share 2 short vignettes with you. The first involves a rare flower found nowhere else on the planet but Nevada. Let's go back to May 18th, 1983. Ronald Reagan lived in the White House. George Bush was the vice president, our friend here. The Space Shuttle Challenger had its maiden launch the month prior, and telecom provider Ameritech was preparing to make the world's first commercial cell phone call. In Esmeralda County, Nevada, a young botanist named Jerry Team was driving through the cragged landscape when a glint of light caught his eye. He worked for the New York Botanical Garden, and the garden had sent him to collect samples of Nevada flowers and other vegetation for its library of plant samples known as an herbarium, which is the largest of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. Team's assignment was simple. He had to find odd, unique, colorful, and hopefully undiscovered plants. Then he was to flatten them using a press in the back of his truck, storing them between sheets of newspaper, and sending them on to New York. If any plants were found to be interesting, more scientists would be sent out. What was fascinating about Team's assignment is that more is known about the flora in Alaska than Nevada. And I think that just sort of underscores how little we actually know about the sagebrush state. Now, 6 years prior to Team's journey, a scientist at Exxon had invented the lithium-ion battery, a feat that would eventually revolutionize our global economy. It was also an invention that would link directly with Team's work that day, work that would attract one of the world's largest automakers, that would stoke the ire of one of America's most preeminent conservation groups, and spread worry throughout the powers of Corridor and Washington and Wall Street. But Team was very much unaware of that future as he guided his SUV down a steep embankment of gravel. All he could think about was finding a place to camp for that night. Those barren hills of Nevada, known as the Silver Peak Range, were not forgiving for those without a plan, especially in the dark. But that hint of light flickering ahead of the dusk beckoned Team. Amid what looked to be an unusual light patches of ground surrounded by a sea of darker rock, the botanist noticed a wildflower that hugged the earth, almost like an herb. Stems of about 6 or so inches protruded from the soil, with leaves of a bluish-gray hue and flowers of pale yellow. Hundreds of the plants seemed grouped together densely at the site, known as Rhyolite Ridge, but Team was unsure why. So Team followed procedure. He collected 15 samples of the flowers, pressed them, labeled them, and cataloged them from New York out of the bed of his truck. He pulled out his tent and camped for the night under the wide expanse of the Milky Way. Back east, months later, Team was reviewing his field notes and still could not identify the plant. A University of Maryland professor wrote to say why. Team had likely discovered a species of plant previously unknown to science. So that professor, Team, and a group of other botanists visited the site the following summer and collected even more samples. And in 1985, they announced in an academic journal that the plant had been newly discovered to science. It was given the moniker Ergonum teami, or Team's buckwheat. Now, why have I given such a long introduction to a flower? You thought you were showing up to talk about critical minerals, not botany. A small plant, Team's buckwheat, looms large in the green energy transition, in these complex issues. Beneath the roots of that plant that Team first discovered that warm spring day sits a massive deposit of lithium, which is used to make lithium-ion batteries. While Team would eventually have 7 plants named after him, it's Team's buckwheat that grows only in those lithium-rich soils of the Nevada hills and nowhere else on Earth, for reasons that rank among the many mysteries of the plant kingdom. In 2016, an Australia-based company was hunting for gold in Nevada and realized that Rhyolite Ridge contained lithium. If that lithium could be mined, it would be wildly profitable, just as global demand for the white metal was set to spike. Electric vehicles from Tesla and others were increasingly seen as key tools to fight climate change. To get at that lithium, though, would require the company to dig an open-pit mine right where Team found the flowers. Thus the tension. What matters more, the plant or the lithium? Is the protection of biodiversity more important than our fight against climate change? Should we protect our special places here in this country and rely on countries overseas for the production and processing of the building blocks to make the devices we use every single day? So that's the first vignette I want to share with you. The second one involves a massive copper deposit in Arizona, more than a mile underground. 2 of the world's largest mining companies, Rio Tinto and BHP, hope to develop this project and extract that copper, which would, just by itself, just that mine, would supply a quarter of the copper consumed in the United States each year, just from one mine. That's a tantalizing prospect for those companies. Both of them know that electric vehicles use twice as much copper as vehicles with internal combustion engines. But because the copper deposit is so deep, Rio and BHP also discovered that it could likely not be extracted by digging from the surface, but rather from below with a method known as block caving, whereby a large section of rock is undercut, creating an artificial cave that fills with its own rubble as it collapses under its own weight. That would create a crater 2 miles wide and 1,000 feet deep. That would swallow the land on the surface completely and destroy it permanently. That surface land is sacred to the San Carlos Apache people. Known as Chichibuitel in the Apache language, literally meaning a broad flat of embry oak trees, Chichibuitel is a place where tribal members have for generations conducted religious ceremonies. The Apache return there often to pray, as they consider the land home to angels and religious deities known as Gan. Some held, and still hold, coming-of-age ceremonies there when teenage girls who have first menstruated reenact the Apache creation myth over a 4-day period of prayer, song, and drumming. The oak trees on the ground yield acorns for traditional food and medicine. Some Apache ancestors are buried amid the volcanic rock. Petroglyphs at the site are considered by some as ancestral footprints. So here's the question again. should the mine be developed if it destroys a site as important to the San Carlos Apache as St. Peter's Basilica is to Roman Catholics? These two are but a handful of the profound choices facing the United States, and indeed every country in the world, as our economy goes increasingly electric. No new mines for any of these metals have opened in the United States for decades, yet multiple projects have been proposed that could produce enough copper to build more than 6 million EVs, enough lithium to build more than 2 million EVs, and enough nickel to build more than 60,000 EVs. Despite the role such proposed U.S. projects would play in abrogating climate change and even lessening the cost of green energy products, each one faces strong, legitimate opposition from environmentalists, neighbors, indigenous groups, or others, underscoring the dilemma facing the country as it tries to go green. U.S. environmental regulators for years put proposed domestic mines under regulatory scrutiny, even as other parts of the government considered loans for new projects, a disconnected strategy that frustrated miners and conservationists alike. Presidents Obama and Trump 1 blocked mining projects for environmental or cultural reasons. Biden blocked some mines also, yet ordered government attorneys to defend others in court, often without any clear indication as to what prompted the differentiation. Mine supporters frequently say the United States already has some of the strictest environmental standards in the world. It can take, in some cases, as much as a decade or longer to obtain a federal mining permit, and the process in Canada can be far shorter. Mine opponents, meanwhile, ask about the cost. Is this mine worth it? Does this piece of land need to be dug up? Why here? Why now? When asked at each successive mine site, the opposition adds up, essentially blocking new projects and ultimately America's efforts to honor the spirit of the Paris Accords. Yet, while it can be cumbersome to obtain a U.S. federal mining permit, the benefits can be immense. Companies do not have to pay royalties on minerals they extract from most federal lands, a quirk of federal law that has governed mining in the western United States since 1872. I wasn't around in 1872, but I do know that President Ulysses S. Grant signed this law specifically to encourage development of the U.S. West. Anyone that's been in California or Arizona lately, or even Nevada, knows the law has reached its intended target. What does it look like to have a mining law for our country that's fit for the 21st century, for our new energy economy? These are just a few of the tough choices facing our country and our planet as we move forward.
Do you think the desire for minerals is the reason for President Trump's obsession with Greenland?
I did mention the Trump word first, although mine was a lowercase t. So, I think there's certainly, I think indications are certainly there that yes, he would want it. I mean, the cost to extract the critical minerals in Greenland would be much higher than, say, Texas, given the cold. But yeah, you can't ignore the geopolitical implications of wanting the critical minerals there. I mean, I will point out that the United States already has a defense pact with Denmark. It's one of its largest Air Force bases, is in Greenland. So the militaristic reasons don't necessarily connect, but so it leads you to the next step to being like, our critical mineral is the main reason. And so I'm curious to see, and I think that will pan out here in the near future.
Is this tariff war that's beginning, not with Mexico and Canada, but with China? The Chinese are worried about it. I have to say, I was with some Chinese. They're very worried about it. Is their reaction to that going to affect our industry much or not?
Well, just think about how interwoven many U.S. manufacturers are with operations in China right now. And China, while it might not have all these critical minerals within its borders, it's invested heavily in mines overseas. And so I referenced the Democratic Republic of Congo in my speech. The United States mining industry used to have a huge presence there, and I chronicle in my book how Freeport-McMoRan, the world's largest copper company headquartered in Phoenix, operated one of the largest cobalt mines there in the DRC, but due to some bad investments, found itself in need of cash, and so sold that mine to a Chinese company that is now basically investing heavily in that facility and increasing production. And so it's been a negative development for the United States that I think many would acknowledge. And so China takes that critical mineral that it takes out of the ground there and it uses it for its economic purposes. And so the country is very, very, very focused on getting supplies wherever it can throughout the world. And so if the United States is able to stop those those investments or even to limit them, that would obviously have a huge effect on China's manufacturing-based economy. So yes, I mean, Beijing is very, very focused on where it can invest across the globe. And the Inflation Reduction Act had this very interesting clause that would allow for tax credits to electric vehicles and other components that were built with critical minerals, yes, and built in the United States, or extracted, in the United States, but also in ally nations. And so that created, shall we call it, sort of a classification separate from China, from Russia, from elsewhere. And so you're starting to see a dual class of investment right now, where China is investing a lot in countries across the world that are not IRA eligible. Meanwhile, the United States is investing soft and hard power in projects across the globe. Now, I know in the past 2 weeks we have a political change here in the country. I mean, we'll see where this goes, but that's the lay of the land in the critical mineral space thus far.
There are two huge copper mines. Both were started by, I think they're American firms, or maybe Canadian. One is in Zaire, I'm
Yes.
sorry, the Congo.
The Congo, yes, yep.
And one is Mongolia.
Yes, Rio Tinto's the
Yeah,
Mongolia
Rio
one.
Tinto,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
And I knew the CEO, and we did some stupid things, frankly, just in a marketing sense. We told the Mongolians that we're going to make like 100% profit. The CEO, why he ever said that in public, I don't know, but he did. And the Mongolians said, wait a second, you're making a profit that size and you need to pay more to us beforehand.
Well, this gets back to what I was saying about Bolivia, right? I mean, host nations no longer are just going to take the 2 or 3% that historically they have gotten, and they're realizing that you can't have this 21st century economy without the minerals that are within their own borders. So they're using that to their advantage. And many countries are not necessarily aligned with the US or Beijing or Moscow or this historical Cold War style setup. And so they're very willing to talk to both sides of the fence.
They actually told me a lot of, because my background is in the developing world, they don't want to be drawn into this conflict. They said, we need both of you. We need China, we need the United States.
Yes.
Actually, what they say, we really don't trust the Chinese, but we need them. We love the Americans. We like your model of governance, but you're unreliable. That's what they said. You're unreliable. And I heard that in Africa, and I just heard it in Bangkok from a prominent international relations professor who said it in front of Chinese. The Chinese were sitting there when he said it. He said, we really prefer the Americans. We don't trust you, Chinese, but we need you because the Americans are unreliable. Very interesting. If we start building mines and processing in the United States, it's going to cost a lot of money just because our labor costs are high.
Yes.
And because they're going to be, the only way to build this is if there's severe or substantial environmental controls so we don't have an environmental disaster. Chinese don't worry about that too much.
They do not. You know, Andrew, I referenced in this speech this Idaho cobalt mine that is closed right now. It's sitting on the side of an Idaho mountain, the only U.S. source of this critical mineral. Part of the reason that it closed is because the company that developed it spent a lot of money actually digging into that mountain, training all its workers, getting them emergency safety protocol, training them on that emergency safety protocol. All of that raised their cost. Meanwhile, as China is increasing production in the Congo at standards that are far below what we would consider acceptable here in the United States, the price plummeted. So the price right now of cobalt is around $10. It needs to be around $20 in order for this mine to make money. So roughly, 50% shift there.
They're doing that deliberately, do you think?
Completely deliberately, yes. It's a pretty transparent bid for market share. Very similar to what OPEC does when it comes to oil production. So if you can push your rival out of market, and especially an American rival, you have greater market share right there. And so then consumers across the world have to come to you. So this gets at the broader question around the higher cost that the questioner is alluding to. Are we willing to pay more for products that were built using metals produced at higher standards? Do you want to pay 10%, 20% more for an iPhone, knowing that the cobalt came from the United States and that the miner there treated its workers well, gave them a living wage, gave them proper safety protocols, et cetera, et cetera? Because right now, the cobalt in your cell phone may have been taken out of the ground by a 7-year-old in the Congo. And anyone that tells you for sure that that did not happen is not speaking with certainty. There's no way to guarantee the provenance of the current supply chain for cobalt. Companies like Apple, like Microsoft, and others have been trying to increase the transparency of it, and they have had some mixed success on there, but by and large, they cannot guarantee that all cobalt is child labor free. And that's partly because cobalt extracted in the DRC versus cobalt extracted in Idaho is cobalt. are you willing to pay 10, 20, 30% more knowing that it's produced safer or better? And I think the average person would have mixed feelings on that. At least when I interview people, that's how they react.
So in eastern Congo, near where this fighting is going on right now,
Yes, yeah.
there is a French plane that leaves every week since the genocide took place in 1994, I think it was, in Rwanda, with coltan on it. Is coltan related to cobalt?
Yes, it's all very similar.
But it's supposedly more expensive, more valuable after it's processed.
Well, the problem is I think what you're alluding to is can it be extracted there in a way that's economical and safe? And critical minerals are where they are. You can't wish them somewhere where they're not. And so here in this example, you have it in a war zone essentially. Yep. And while there could be trillions of dollars worth of materials there that would really help either the South Sudanese or the Sudan government, in this current climate, it's not going to be produced at all. It might be in small batches here or there, but in order to do a large amount that would really have an effect, it's not going to happen. And so that's part of the issue here as well. Part of the reason why Afghanistan's critical minerals have not been tapped yet by the current government, when the U.S. was there, the Russians, et cetera.
We actually did a survey, USAID, of the value of those, not just the minerals, but there's semi-precious stones.
Yes.
Billions of dollars worth of Afghan. The problem is there was a warlord that controlled the area, and he said, you come in here and try to extract this, I will kill all of you. So we decided
that
not
centers
a
the
good
mind.
idea. Yeah. So can you imagine, though, that there might be some technological discoveries, I suppose you can, that would obviate the need for these particular metals?
So what I would say is we are broadly moving from a liquid-based economy, petroleum, to a more materials-based economy. That's happening. Now, I'm not saying we're going to get rid of internal combustion engines completely. I'm not saying we're going to get rid of oil and gas. I still think it is a huge part of our economy, and I have many good friends in the oil and gas industry. I drove here today in a ICE-powered car. What I would say, we are generally shifting to a more materials-based economy. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, yes, there might be different battery technologies in the future, but they still will be built, I would place heavy money on it, by a critical mineral. I get a lot of questions about sodium-ion batteries. People saying, oh gosh, are we going to replace lithium-ion batteries with sodium-ion batteries? I don't know the answer to that, and I think anyone that tells you with certainty yes or no, is not speaking with a full deck of cards. But what I would say is this: back in 1989, 1990, this company known as Sony debuted this product known as the Walkman that you could recharge and walk around with, and everyone thought it was the most amazing thing in the world. And because it had a lithium-ion battery in there, and then there was the Sony camcorder, where you could record your kids, rechargeable battery. That was 1989, 1990. That was, almost 40 years ago. And manufacturers have adapted their processes to the lithium-ion battery. That's been a pretty long time frame. They've gotten used to it. They know the technology. They know how to incorporate it into their equipment. If you're going to say that now we're going to shift to something completely different, like a sodium-ion battery, well, that's going to require another long runway right there right now. So you've got an industry that's very comfortable with this technology. Lithium is also the lightest metal on the periodic table of the elements. So that's why it's great for your Walkman, for your cell phone, et cetera. So the equipment that we have, the materials that we have now to power this equipment are the way that they are for a reason. Now, yes, there could be technologies in the future that could change that, but for my money, I still think it's going to be a material which still requires a grappling with these broader choices that I talked about in the lecture.
So I recall in 1979, Elliot Richardson, who was a political figure from Massachusetts, where my wife and I are from, was negotiating the Law of the Sea Convention at the UN. And I knew him, and he was telling me all of the politics. The politics in the U.S. is Congress would not approve the treaty, even though we negotiated and wrote the whole thing.
It's fascinating, right? We did not sign it.
Yes, no, we didn't sign it. And the problem is that mining companies in the U.S. were unwilling to invest the money for the technology to get to the nodules at the bottom of 5 miles down, unless they had that convention in place. I don't think the Chinese or the Russians worry about that very much. But do you know anything about those nodules at the bottom? They're apparently extremely rich in rare metals. Is that true?
It is. You're referring to deep sea mining.
Yes, deep sea mining.
There are basically 3 types of deep sea mining, and you're referring to what's considered the most popular there are these nodules that sit on the ocean floor. And
They're,
the
they're
most
giant. They're giant.
They are, yeah. The most popular spot is known as the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. It's south of Mexico, south of Hawaii and roughly west of Mexico. Basically a big flat plain, just, a lot of these nodules just sitting there. And the appeal is that you go down there, you pick them up, you bring them to the surface, you throw them in a refinery, and then out pops the metal, very little waste. The average mine on land, when you take, say, Andrew, you took 100 pounds out of an average mine on land, well, less than 1 pound of that would be copper. The rest would be waste. 99 pounds of waste, that's a lot of waste. But the appeal of these nodules is that you wouldn't have, nearly as much waste, very, very little waste. But the problem is that nobody really knows what role these nodules play in the ecosystem of the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. They've been there for eons, slowly getting bigger, and we really don't know if they are food for creatures down there, if they have other sort of role. And so a lot of ecologists and others are saying, hey, let's hold off. You mentioned the Law of the Sea, which the United States did not sign. And so the Law of the Sea set up basically a UN office in Kingston, Jamaica. It's a hardship, I would imagine, to be based there. So they basically have been debating for years as to what are the best standards by which we could allow the extraction of these nodules to take place. But of course, you're only subject to those standards if your country has signed it. The United States has not. And also, it's in the middle of the ocean, so how are you going? What's the enforcement mechanism? So there's all these questions, not only about the ecology and the environmental stewardship, but also sort of the practicality of the enforcement around this. But what we do know is that at the end of the day, many of the issues that I talked about in the lecture around digging a hole in the ground, dusty truck traffic, dynamite blasting, et cetera, you don't have that in this deep sea mining. And many of these nodules contain a lot of these critical minerals that I referenced. So should we basically take these nodules out, recognizing that, hey, we might not fully understand what role they play in the ecology of the ocean, but at least we're not digging up grandma's backyard. To me, this is another level of choice that we just haven't been accustomed to debating, and I do argue in the book that we should.
And it would probably take an act of Congress, would it not, to decide some of these things?
Well, and for the Law of the Sea, yes, certainly.
The Law of the Sea, I don't mean the Law of the Sea. I mean a policy in terms of whether or not we domestically mine this or mine this abroad, and if we do, what are the constraints and the environmental protections that are required.
Yeah, I think, and I alluded to this a little bit in the lecture, but the law that's governed hard rock mining in much of the US has been around for more than 150 years right now. What would it look like to have a federal mining law that is fit for purpose for this time? What would it look like to have regulations that acknowledge the reality that we're in right now? I do argue in the book that these are one of the choices that we need to be discussing. And so if you are talking with your regulators, with your elected officials, with policymakers about what you as voters want, then I think we're going to get to a better realization from members of Congress that this is an area that they need to act on. I was speaking about the book in November, middle of November, to a high school class. And I met a young woman who had just voted. She was a senior. She just turned 18. And so we were talking about a lot of these issues. And she was a little perplexed. And she said, okay, well, what's the right answer? Tell me. You wrote the book. And I said, well, you tell me. Well, what would you say if Kamala Harris or Donald Trump walked in the room right now? You voted for one of them. What would you say to them about these issues? She said to me, I don't know. You wrote the book. Tell me. She got visibly agitated with me. And so I think that to me is just an anecdote about our inability to grapple with these tough choices. There's no easy answers here. It's shades of gray. I made the quip about digging up grandma's backyard. I'm not saying we all have to have mines in our backyard. But we're going to have mines somewhere. Yep. And what are the standards by which we could allow it?
Any questions from the audience that have come up since you wrote your cards?
Hi.
First of all, great presentation. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Can you speak a little bit more about the capability of recycling some of these metals when somebody turns in? You have a lot of these millennials, of which I'm not, but they seem to get a new cell phone every time the moon rises. So it's like,
how do they afford it? It's beyond me.
Yeah, it really is. And who wants to, transfer all your contacts over? Who wants to go through all that?
You preach, man.
But be that as it may, so what is the potential of recycling to reduce the need to, be tearing up the earth or digging up the oceans?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I have a pretty meaty chapter in the book about recycling, and it starts with an explosion for reasons that I'll get into. I mean, when people think about recycling, you think about it as a silver bullet for these issues. Oh, we don't need to have a mine. We'll just recycle our way there. When you just look at the sheer IEA and other demand projections, we're not going to recycle our way there. So, okay, be it as it may. Now we need to have more recycling, but what does it look like to have more recycling alongside more mines? And it requires more facilities. Part of the reason we need to have more recycling facilities is because think about transporting 1,000 old cell phone batteries. Each of them might have like 1 or 2% charge in there. Now, they're sitting in a truck bed or a rail car bed, and one of them just spontaneously explodes. It's very common. It's called thermal runaway. And just think about the chain reaction. And so I start this chapter talking about an explosion in a rail car in Houston that was taking a bunch of old cell phone batteries from Atlanta to Los Angeles, to a facility there. And why was it going across the entire country? Because there was not that many facilities near Atlanta in order to do that. And so what would it look like to have an ecosystem?
Did that actually happen, or you just made it up?
No, it happened.
It did happen.
It happened. And I would say it was noticed by a trade publication in London of all places.
And did anybody get hurt, or?
Nobody thankfully got hurt. A guy got thrown against the wall near a rail yard in Houston. He got pretty shaken up about it, but thankfully he was okay. The fire was put out after a while, though you need special chemicals to put out battery fires. And I use that anecdote in the book on purpose because I want the average reader to think through that this is about so much more than just being like, oh yeah, I'm going to recycle this. There's a whole supply chain, there's a whole ecosystem that needs to be created. Think about if you have an internal combustion engine, when your battery dies, you have a lead acid battery in there, you turn it in, you get a new battery. What you don't realize is that there's a small percentage of that new battery's cost that pays for recycling infrastructure for lead acid batteries, all behind the scenes. You'll never see it, you'll never interact with it, but you are paying for this whole behind the scenes infrastructure to recycle lead acid batteries. Same thing does not exist for lithium-ion batteries. There's no legislation that's created it yet. What would it look like to have a legislation in place or even a system that says we're going to put X% on the cost of every lithium-ion battery to create this whole ecosystem to actually sort of standardize it in our country? I profile in that same chapter 2 CEOs of recycling companies that are trying to take a bite at this apple. It's very complex. There's a lot of economics involved. There's a lot of logistics. So you get to sort of see what makes them tick here. But recycling is not the silver bullet that people think it will be. I think it needs to certainly grow. I'll make a confession, and I'm going to make a confession for Andrew too. He doesn't know it yet, but we both have a drawer full of old cell phones. I feel confident that you probably do. I think if I asked for a show of hands, a lot of us would say we have a drawer of old cell phones and other equipment that needs to be recycled.
No one has an old cell phone.
Come on, there we go. All of this, you have a mine in your house without even realizing it. Seriously, these are, lithium does not lose its ability to retain a charge just because it's been sitting in your kitchen drawer for 10 years. So the more we think about this and exercising this muscle as recycling, the better we're going to be to solving these questions. But the whole system needs to be built out.
Can I also add in something that has to be considered is the necessary energy that's going to be required by those facilities and
Sure.
infrastructure, and it's
Yeah.
something for people to consider.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so going back to the Bolivia lithium example, so they have the lithium. They want to build adjacent industry to that,
Yes.
but do they have the energy to do that?
That's a question there too. It's a fascinating country. If you ever get a chance to go, I highly recommend it. Not all of their people are connected to the grid, and so yes, you're getting at issues, I think, of social justice. You're getting issues of rural development. I think these are all issues for the government in La Paz and the regional governments to consider there as well. But it is part of it. And I think when you look at the examples, I'm sure you do, of other countries that have prioritized resource extraction over their own citizens' welfare and development, I think they've done it to their detriment.
Sure, they have. Yes, sir.
There must be estimates of the reserves, right? Are they, do we have any idea how accurate they might be, or what they're saying about what kind of reserves we have?
Yeah, so the United States has large supplies, certainly of copper, some nickel, certainly lithium, some rare earths. I could go through sort of the laundry list, but in short, there are supplies in the country. It's perhaps not enough to completely satiate the country's demand, but what I would say that unlike petroleum, which is lost when you burn it off in a combustion engine, you can recycle, as we were discussing with this gentleman here again and again. So at some point, we don't know when that'll be, we'll hit a point that's where we can achieve what's known as a fully circular economy. Now, anyone that tells you when that's going to happen, some people say 2050, some people say 2070, they're out to lunch. At some point, we will hit it, and we'll dig our last mine in the ground, but we don't know when that will be. But yes, the U.S. has large supplies of these critical minerals in the ground. One of the tensions that I do explore with the book, though, is just because they're there, should we take them out? I have a chapter that talks about the Twin Metals Copper and Nickel project in northern Minnesota. It is a massive deposit that's underground. It also would extract and produce cobalt, which, as we discussed, it can be extracted with child labor in the DRC. So you've got issues of worker equity, worker fairness, et cetera. Could we sort of national security? It sounds on paper cool, like let's extract it there. But the problem is that deposit lies right underneath a watershed that goes into the Great Lakes. And the type of rock that contains this metal is known as sulfide ore. And sulfide ore, when it's exposed to water, creates sulfuric acid. So if you have an accident and you pollute this waterway, are you then going to pollute the Great Lakes? These are some of the questions and the tensions that we have to be thinking through. And so are we just going to let that giant deposit sit there and not exploit it or not take it out because of this tension?
One of the largest uranium mines in the world that actually produced the uranium for the atomic bombs of World War II is also in DRC. And they closed the mine, but there are a lot of artisanal poor people, poor
Yes.
men going in and digging. They have no protection, and they're digging uranium. And so the United Nations did a report on it and said, we recommend that an American mining company or Canadian mining company take over the mine and properly mine the stuff so they have safety standards and process it so there's not a lot of environmental damage, because right now there is. And what we did discover is the Iranians were in there taking the uranium from the artisanal farmer, the artisanal miners, who just go in and dig. They have a shovel, they go in and dig. And it was going back to Iran for Iran to build their nuclear weapons with. We put a stop through it because it has to go through Tanzania, and the U.S. diplomatically went there. And the Tanzanians are very cooperative in shutting the thing down. But there's a high risk.
It's a huge risk area, not only for the people that actually do it, but
Sure.
for the reputation for the entire global mining industry. It was just last week that there was artisanal miners in Mali that were operating at a gold mine, and the shaft collapsed,
Yep.
and they died. And this was, I think, a mother and some of your young children.
Yep.
So I think this gets at sort of the tension there as well, is that people often need to do this for economic reasons and to extract these. And gold is not a critical mineral, but obviously has value, and
Sure.
the price has been surging in the past few years, so you can see the appeal right there.
Okay. Oh, my heavens. Yes, sir.
I hear what you're saying, like, I don't want to strip mine grandma's backyard, but talk to me about like subsurface mining. I mean, it seems to me we could subsurface mine grandma's backyard, or is that too simplistic a way to look at it?
I want to meet your grandma. So the short answer is sort of yes, but it all depends on the geological structure there. I referenced the San Carlos Apache fight against the deposit in Arizona. So sure, I mean, the question is, could you not extract that copper without causing that subsurface subsidence, that large crater?
Much more expensive.
Much more expensive. You might not have as much economic return. It might not even be worthwhile. And the geological deposit, in some cases in the world, might not actually be conducive to doing without the crater. So it all depends really on the situation. Geology is not always conducive to just what you might want it to do. And mining, there's no way around it. It's intrusive. There's just no way around it.
Yes, sir.
How is the demographic shift that we're going to be seeing over the next 50 years going to change this? Is anyone studying this?
Demographic shift in the
As in decreasing population, possibly? Will
And
demand
everywhere
change?
except Africa. Africa will be the largest continent by far. Their fertility rates are extremely high. The rest of the world is shifting, but China is, they're actually sending police into people's homes to make sure they don't have contraceptive devices or condoms to force people to have more children. People are refusing to do it. So their fertility rates are way, way down now in China.
How will that affect the demand for these resources?
I've not seen, that's a good question. I've not seen good studies looking at that. What I would say is that anecdotally, and also backed up by intergovernmental organization data, we know that the more our lives go electronic, the more we're going to need many of these devices. I made the reference to leaf blowers, which yes, I own a leaf blower. I bought one when I was writing this book, powered by a lithium-ion battery. And if I had bought it 10 years before, or even 5 years before, it would have been powered by a two-stroke engine. So I think just think about all the devices in your life. Regardless of, let's say, where the United States is population-wise in 30 or 40 years, we might have more, in fact, I'm sure we will have more robots in our homes doing more things for us. Think about Roomba that vacuums your floors right now. You would not have had a Roomba 5 or 10 years ago, and you do now. So I think regardless of where the demographic trends go, we're going to see a lot more electrification in our lives. And that's why I say this is about so much more than Teslas or EVs in general.
Yes, sir.
Earlier, that mines typically use a lot of water. The West, more broadly, but northern Nevada in particular, looking at Thacker Pass here, not known for water.
Sure.
How can you speak more on that and any possible solutions and conflicts there?
Yes, so you're referencing Thacker Pass, which is a lithium project in northern Nevada that a company known as Lithium Americas is developing. And it's a huge meaty chapter in my book. I spent a lot of time with a conservation group, especially one conservationist who was fighting that project, and him and a coalition of folks sued the U.S. Bureau of Land Management to try to stop the project. And so you get to sort of explore the tension on all sides there. One of the tension points is around water. A cattle rancher in northern Nevada was concerned that the mine could decrease the water table levels. You're using just insane amounts of water. I mean, one of the things you do if you are a mining company is if you are exploring, you can find a big deposit, but then you also, of course, need to have access to water. And you need to get, if you're, obviously the U.S. West is very familiar with the politics of water, and so they try to secure adequate supplies. And there can be tension points with local communities around water, and it can affect some water tables. But these things are monitored pretty closely, and I can tell you that it was adjudicated in a court case, and a U.S. federal judge ruled for the project, for the Bureau of Land Management, for their studies on water. But there's still a lot of concern around water table levels. You mentioned other parts, Arizona, obviously, biggest copper producing state in the United States. It has dwindling water reserve. There's no way around it. So where did...
Can you use salt water?
Well, I was just going to reference Chile, actually. So in northern Chile, there's the Atacama Desert, which has huge copper mines and huge lithium facilities. Yeah. BHP and Rio Tinto also operate there. They basically put a pipe from the mountains all the way down to the Pacific Ocean, and they're sucking seawater up and desalinating it. And you can imagine how much that costs, but they recognize that they need to earn a social license to operate and also just need water. So they're paying this high cost.
Salt Lake in Salt Lake City is almost disappearing. And the solution, and I said, are you serious? And I was at a board of directors meeting there, and I said, is this serious? They're going to build a pipeline from the Pacific Ocean all the way to Salt Lake City.
Yep.
And just pump salt water back into the lake because they need the
it's all connected.
Yeah,
Yes.
it is all connected.
Yes.
Interesting. Anyway, we've run out of time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Mr.
Andrew. Thank you for being here.
Very well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.